The lightning split the sky like God's own whip, and Thea Kendrick didn't flinch as she snapped the reins over the backs of her four-horse team, driving them forward through mud that sucked at the wagon wheels like quicksand. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick she could barely see the road ahead, but she kept going because stopping meant death in these Missouri mountains, and she had 3 orphaned children huddled under canvas in the wagon bed behind her, counting on her to get them through. It was late September 1872, and the autumn storm had blown in from nowhere, turning the mountain pass into a nightmare of slick rocks and flooding streams. Thea had left Wyatt 3 days ago with supplies for the Henderson family homestead 30 miles north, but when she'd arrived, she'd found the cabin burned to the foundation and John Henderson's body in the yard with 2 arrows in his back. His wife Mary had been inside with their newborn. The 3 surviving Henderson children, ranging from 4 to 9 years old, had been hiding in the root cellar for 2 days without food or water when Thea found them. Now she was racing against time and weather to get them back to civilization before exposure or worse caught up with them. The oldest child, a girl named Sarah, was already feverish and shaking. Thea had wrapped her in every blanket she could spare, but the cold rain found its way through every crack in the wagon cover. Thunder rolled across the mountains like cannon fire, and the horses screamed in terror as another lightning bolt struck a pine tree not 50 yards ahead. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks and flaming splinters, crashing across the narrow mountain road and blocking their path completely. Thea hauled back on the reins, her strong arms straining as she fought to keep the panicked horses from bolting over the cliff edge that dropped away into darkness on their left. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the wagon skidded sideways in the mud, wheels sliding inexorably toward the precipice. She could hear the children screaming behind her, feel the wagon tilting as the back wheels lost purchase. Then she saw it through the rain, a narrow gate set into the rock wall on the right side of the road, leading to what looked like a private trail cutting up into the dense forest. The gate was closed, held shut by a heavy chain, and Thea knew without being told that whoever owned that land didn't welcome uninvited guests. This was deep mountain country where men valued their privacy and defended their borders with loaded rifles. But the wagon was still sliding, and she was out of options. Thea tied off the reins and jumped down into the ankle-deep mud, stumbling as her boots lost traction. She caught herself on the wagon wheel and pushed forward toward the gate, rain plastering her long dark hair to her face and neck. She was 23 years old, tall and strong from years of hard work, but even she struggled against the wind that tried to shove her back. She reached the gate and grabbed the chain, but it was locked with a padlock the size of her fist. Behind her, the wagon lurched another foot toward the cliff edge. The children were crying, their voices thin with terror. Thea did the only thing she could think of. She pulled her revolver from the holster at her hip, aimed at the padlock, and fired. The shot was almost lost in the thunder, but the lock shattered and the chain fell away. She shoved the gate open and ran back to the wagon, climbing up to the driver's bench and releasing the brake. The horses needed no encouragement. They lunged forward through the gate and onto the private trail, their hooves finding better purchase on the gravel surface. Thea guided them up the winding path as it climbed steeply into the forest, the trees providing some shelter from the worst of the storm. They rounded a bend and suddenly she saw light ahead, warm and yellow against the storm-dark evening. A cabin materialized out of the rain, solid and well-built, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Outbuildings clustered around it, a barn, and what looked like a smokehouse and workshop. This was no temporary camp but a permanent homestead, carved out of the wilderness by someone who knew what they were doing. The cabin door opened before Thea could bring the wagon to a full stop, and a man stepped out onto the covered porch. He was the biggest human being Thea had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway, and arms thick with muscle visible even under his heavy wool shirt. His hair was dark and hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who feared nothing in these mountains, and Thea saw the rifle in his hands before she saw anything else. But he wasn't pointing it at her. He was looking past her at the wagon, at the crying children, at the mud-splattered horses on the verge of collapse. His eyes, she saw, were a startling shade of gray-blue, like mountain water over stone. "Gate was locked for a reason," he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily over the rain. But there was no anger in it, only statement of fact. Thea climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking with exhaustion. Water streamed from her clothes and hair. "I shot the lock off," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'll pay for it. Right now I need shelter for these children, or the littlest one is going to die of fever before morning." The mountain man studied her for a long moment, taking in her muddy split riding skirt, the revolver at her hip, the determined set of her jaw. Then he leaned his rifle against the cabin wall and walked down the porch steps into the rain. "Get them inside," he said, moving past her to the wagon. "I'll see to your horses." Relief flooded through Thea so intensely she almost staggered. "Thank you," she said, but he was already unhitching the team with practiced efficiency, his big hands gentle on the harness straps. Thea climbed into the wagon bed and gathered little Sarah into her arms. The girl was burning up, her face flushed and her breathing labored. The two boys, James and Thomas, clung to each other in terror. They'd watched their parents die 3 days ago, and every strange thing since then had been a new horror. "It's all right," Thea told them softly. "We're safe now. This man is going to help us." She carried Sarah toward the cabin, and the boys followed, stumbling through the mud on exhausted legs. The mountain man had left the door open, and warm air rolled out to meet them as Thea stepped inside. The cabin was larger than it had looked from outside, a single great room with a sleeping loft above and a massive stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A fire crackled on the hearth, and the space was warm and dry and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something cooking in a pot hung over the flames. Furs covered the floor and hung on the walls, and everything was neat and well-maintained with the precision of a man who lived alone and liked order. Thea laid Sarah on a bed built into the wall near the fireplace, the best spot for warmth. She pulled off the girl's wet clothes and wrapped her in the dry furs piled on the bed, then turned to help the boys out of their soaked garments. They were shivering violently, their lips blue with cold. The door opened and the mountain man came in carrying Thea's supply packs and the wet blankets from the wagon. Water dripped from his hair and beard, but he seemed unbothered by it. He set everything down near the door and shrugged out of his own wet jacket, hanging it on a peg. "Horses are in the barn," he said. "Fed and rubbed down. They'll be fine." He moved to a trunk against the wall and pulled out more blankets and what looked like several shirts that would swallow the boys whole but would at least be warm and dry. He handed them to Thea without a word. "Thank you," Thea said again, taking the clothes and helping the boys into the oversized shirts. They hung on the children like dresses, but they were made of soft flannel, and the boys stopped shivering almost immediately. The mountain man ladled something from the pot into wooden bowls and set them on the table. "Venison stew," he said. "Boys should eat." James and Thomas needed no encouragement. They fell on the food like starving animals, which Thea supposed they nearly were. She stayed with Sarah, bathing the girl's face with water from the bucket near the door, trying to bring down the fever. The mountain man watched for a moment, then went to a shelf and took down a jar filled with dried leaves and roots. He added some to a tin cup, poured hot water over it, and brought it to Thea. "Willow bark and feverfew," he said. "Get her to drink it if you can. It'll help with the fever." Thea took the cup, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard every day of his life. "You know medicine?" she asked. "Enough to survive out here," he said. "Name's Zachary Holt. Most folks call me Zach Thea Kendrick," she replied. "I run freight out of Wyatt. These are the Henderson children. Their parents were killed 3 days ago. I found them hiding in the root cellar, and I'm trying to get them back to town." Zach's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray-blue eyes. "Indians? I think so. 2 arrows in the father's back, cabin burned. I didn't stay to investigate, just grabbed the children and ran." He nodded slowly. "Smart. Small war party, probably. They've been pushed south out of their territory by settlers, and they're angry about it. Can't blame them much, but that doesn't help folks who get caught in the crossfire." He gestured at Sarah. "Get that tea into her. I'll make up more beds for the boys." Over the next hour, Thea coaxed half the cup of medicinal tea into Sarah while Zach set up pallets for the boys near the fire. They were already falling asleep, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. Thea watched Zach move around the cabin with quiet competence, his big body somehow never seeming clumsy or out of place despite the confined space. She found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was younger than his size, and beard suggested, probably not much past 30. There was a scar on his right forearm, white against tanned skin, that looked like it had come from a knife or claw. His hands were never still, always busy with some task, and she noticed he moved with barely a sound despite his bulk. This was a man who had learned to survive in the wilderness, she thought. A man who had chosen solitude over society and made a life for himself out here where most people would starve or freeze or go mad from loneliness. She wondered what had driven him to it. "You should eat something," Zach said, startling her out of her thoughts. He held out a bowl of stew, and Thea realized she was shaking with hunger. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. "Thank you," she said, taking the bowl. The stew was rich and savory, thick with vegetables and tender meat, better than anything she usually bothered to make for herself on the trail. Zach settled into a chair by the fire, his own bowl in his hands. For a while they ate in silence, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle on the hearth. It was strange, Thea thought, to feel so comfortable with a man she'd just met. But there was something solid and trustworthy about Zachary Holt. He'd opened his gate and let her through when he could have turned her away. He'd taken in 3 orphaned children without question. He'd tended her horses and offered medicine and food and shelter, asking nothing in return. "Why do you live out here alone?" Thea asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too direct. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." But Zach didn't seem offended. He finished his stew and set the bowl aside, leaning back in his chair. "Came out here 5 years ago," he said slowly, as if the words didn't come easy. "Was a buffalo hunter before that, working the plains. Made good money, but it was ugly work, killing hundreds of animals just for their hides, leaving the meat to rot. Indians would watch us sometimes from the hills, and I couldn't blame them for hating us. We were destroying their whole way of life." He paused, staring into the fire. "One day I just couldn't do it anymore. Took my earnings and came up into these mountains. Built this place with hunt what I need to eat, trap furs to sell for supplies once or twice a year. It's a good life. Quiet, clean." Thea heard what he didn't say, the loneliness under the words. "Don't you miss people?" she asked softly. Zach's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile under all that beard. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but people are complicated. Out here, things are simple, honest. A tree doesn't lie to you. A deer doesn't betray you. The mountain doesn't pretend to be something it's not." "Someone hurt you," Thea said. It wasn't a question. Zach looked at her then, really looked at her, and Thea felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "We've all been hurt," he said quietly. "Question is what you do about it. Run toward more hurt or run away from it, and you chose to run away." "I chose to survive," he corrected. "There's a difference." Before Thea could respond, Sarah made a small sound from the bed. Thea was on her feet instantly, crossing to the girl's side. Sarah's fever seemed lower, the flush fading from her cheeks, but she was crying softly in her sleep. "She's dreaming," Zach said from behind Thea. "Probably nightmares. Seeing what she saw, that's to be expected." "She's so young," Thea whispered, smoothing Sarah's damp hair back from her forehead. "They're all so young to have lost everything. What'll happen to them when you get back to Wyatt?" Thea sighed. "There's an orphanage of sorts. Mrs. Patterson takes in children who have nowhere else to go. She's a good woman, does her best, but she's got a dozen kids already, and not much money. These 3 will have food and a roof, but that's about all. No other family? None that I know of. John Henderson was from back east somewhere, came out here to homestead. His wife was from St. Louis. If they have relations, I don't know how to find them." Zach was quiet for a long moment. "You're not related to them," he said finally, "but you risked your life to save them, drove through a storm that could have killed you, shot your way through my gate." "Why?" Thea turned to face him. "Because nobody else was going to," she said simply. "I was there. I found them, so they became my responsibility." She smiled tiredly. "I suppose that sounds foolish." "No," Zach said, and there was something in his voice that made Thea's breath catch. "It sounds brave." Their eyes met and held, and for a moment the cabin seemed to shrink around them. The space between them charged with something Thea didn't quite have a name for. Then Sarah stirred again, and the moment broke. "You should sleep," Zach said, his voice returning to its normal gruffness. "You're dead on your feet. Take the bed up in the loft. I'll watch the children tonight." "I couldn't," Thea protested. "This is your home. I've already imposed enough. You've been driving for 3 days with no sleep," Zach said firmly. "You won't be any good to those kids if you collapse. I'll wake you if there's any change in the girl's condition." Thea wanted to argue, but she was swaying with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried her through the storm was wearing off, leaving her wrung out and shaking. "All right," she said finally, "but just for a few hours." She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a bed there, neatly made with more furs and blankets. She collapsed onto it fully clothed except for her muddy boots. and sleep claimed her before she could think another thought. When Thea woke, pale morning light was filtering through the shuttered window of the loft, and she could smell coffee brewing and bacon frying. For a confused moment she didn't know where she was, then memory returned in a rush. She sat up quickly, expecting to feel the soreness of sleeping in her clothes, but someone had covered her with an additional blanket during the night, and she'd slept deeper and better than she had in weeks. She climbed down the ladder to find the cabin transformed by daylight. The storm had passed, and sunshine streamed through the windows. The boys were awake and sitting at the table eating breakfast, their faces cleaner than they'd been last night. Sarah was still in bed by the fire, but her eyes were open, and she was taking small sips from a cup that Zach held for her. "There you are," Zach said when he saw Thea. "Was starting to wonder if you'd sleep all day." "What time is it?" Thea asked, mortified. "Near noon. You needed the rest." He set the cup down and straightened. "Girl's fever broke about dawn. She'll be weak for a few days, but she'll recover." Relief washed through Thea so strongly she felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered. "There's food on the stove," Zach said. "Coffee too, help yourself." Thea did, filling a plate and a cup and joining the boys at the table. They were subdued but no longer terrified, and James even managed a small smile when she ruffled his hair. "Mr. Zach showed us his pelts," James said, shyly. "He's got a beaver bigger than you too," Thomas piped up. "And he's got a wolf skin on the wall that he says he fought with a knife when his rifle misfired." Thea looked at Zach in surprise. He shrugged, looking faintly embarrassed. "Wolf was sick," he said, "made it crazy. It attacked me and I had no choice. Seemed a waste not to keep the pelt." "You fought a wolf with a knife and you call it a waste to keep the pelt?" Thea shook her head in amazement. "You're either very brave or very crazy." "Probably both," Zach admitted, and there was a hint of humor in his eyes that made Thea's heart skip a beat. After breakfast, Zach went out to check on the horses, and Thea helped the children wash properly in a basin of warm water. Sarah was well enough to sit up, though she clung to Thea with desperate strength. "Where's Mama?" the little girl whispered. "I want Mama." Thea's heart broke. She gathered Sarah close, stroking her hair. "Your Mama's gone, sweetheart," she said softly. "She's in heaven with your papa now, but I'm going to take care of you. You and your brothers. I promise you'll be safe." Sarah cried then. Great racking sobs that shook her thin body, and Thea held her through it all, rocking her and murmuring comfort, even though she knew nothing could really ease this pain. The boys came and pressed close too, all of them huddled together in their shared grief, and Thea let her own tears fall for these children and their murdered parents and the cruelty of a world that could do such things. She didn't hear Zach come back inside, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside them with his big hand gentle on James's shoulder. "It's all right to cry," he said quietly. "Your folks loved you, and you loved them, and that love doesn't go away just because they're gone. You carry it with you. It makes you strong, even when you think you can't be strong anymore." James looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Did your folks die too?" "My pa did," Zach said. "Long time ago. I was about your age. Remembering him still hurts sometimes. But it's a good hurt because it means he mattered. Means I loved him enough that losing him left a hole. You'll carry that hole for your folks, but you'll also carry all the good things they taught you. All the times they made you laugh. All the times they tucked you in at night and told you they loved you. That doesn't die. That's forever." Thea stared at him. This mountain man who lived alone and claimed he didn't need people, speaking comfort to orphaned children with a gentleness that made her throat tight. Who was Zachary Holt really under that rough exterior and guarded heart? The day passed quietly. The children napped, exhausted by their tears. Thea helped Zach with chores around the homestead, feeding the chickens she hadn't noticed the night before, hauling water from the stream that ran behind the cabin, checking supplies in the barn. They worked in comfortable silence most of the time, but occasionally Zach would point out something, an eagle circling overhead, a deer trail leading into the forest, the way the mountains looked in the clear light after a storm. "It's beautiful here," Thea said, pausing to look out over the valley spread below them. From Zach's homestead high on the mountainside, she could see for miles endless forest and stone and sky. "It is," Zach agreed. He stood beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Took me a long time to see it, though. First year or so, all I saw was the work, the danger, how hard everything was. But then one morning I woke up and looked out and really saw it for the first time. Understood that I was part of something bigger than myself, something that would be here long after I was gone." "Don't you ever want to share it with someone?" The question was out before Thea could stop it, and she felt her cheeks heat. I'm sorry, I keep asking intrusive questions. But Zach didn't seem bothered. He turned to look at her, and his gray-blue eyes were thoughtful. Used to think I didn't, he said slowly. Used to think I was fine alone, but lately, he trailed off, then shook his head. Doesn't matter what I want. This life isn't for everyone. It's hard and lonely and sometimes dangerous. Not many people would choose it. Maybe you just haven't met the right person, Thea said softly. Something flared in Zach's eyes, intense and searching. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. We should get back, he said finally. Kids will be waking up soon. That evening they ate together around the table, all 5 of them, and it felt to Thea like a strange sort of family. The children were more animated now, asking Zach questions about the mountains and the animals and whether he'd ever seen a bear. Zach answered patiently, and once or twice Thea even saw him smile. A real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look years younger. After the children were asleep, Thea and Zach sat by the fire again. Thea was mending one of the boys' shirts that had torn, and Zach was working on a piece of leather, cutting it with careful precision. What are you making? Thea asked. New reins for your wagon, Zach said. Saw yours were nearly worn through. Won't hold much longer. You don't have to do that, Thea protested. I know. He kept working, his hands steady, and sure Thea watched him for a moment, then set down her mending. Zach, I need to ask you something. The road back to Wyatt, the tree that fell across it last night, is there another way around? Zach shook his head. That's the only pass through the mountains for 20 miles in either direction. If that tree's still down, you'll have to wait for someone to clear it or go way out of your way. Could add a week to your journey. I don't have a week, Thea said worriedly. I told Mrs. Patterson I'd be back in 5 days at most, and Sarah's not strong enough for a long journey yet. Then you stay here until she is, Zach said simply. Few more days of good food and rest, she'll be fine. Meanwhile, I can ride down and check that tree. See if I can clear it enough for your wagon to get through. I can't ask you to do that, Thea said. You've already done so much. Zach set down his leather working and looked at her directly. You're not asking. I'm offering. Big difference. He paused. Truth is, it's been nice having people here. Noise and life. Reminds me what I've been missing. What have you been missing? Thea asked softly. Zach was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Everything, he said finally. I thought I wanted to be alone, thought I was done with people and their complications, but maybe I was just scared. Maybe I ran away instead of dealing with things. What were you running from? He glanced at her, then back at the fire. My wife died, he said quietly. 6 years ago, cholera. We'd been married less than a year. I was working the buffalo herds, gone for months at a time. When I came back to camp, she was already dead and buried. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Thea's chest ached with sympathy. I'm so sorry, Zach. I blame myself, he continued, the words coming faster now as if he'd held them in too long. Thought, if I'd been there, maybe I could have done something. Saved her somehow. I got angry at everyone and everything. Picked fights. Drank too much. Finally realized I was going to end up dead too if I didn't change something. So I came up here and built this place and told myself I didn't need anybody. But you do need people, Thea said gently. We all do. That's not weakness, Zach. That's being human. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Thea felt that strange electricity again, that sense of connection she couldn't explain. You're different than most people, he said. Strong, brave. You don't ask for help even when you need it. You just do what has to be done. So do you, Thea pointed out. Maybe that's why I like you, Zach said, and his voice had gone low and rough in a way that made Thea's pulse quicken. You like me? She asked, trying to keep her tone light even though her heart was pounding. Yeah, Zach said, I do. More than I probably should, considering you're leaving in a few days and I'll probably never see you again. The thought of never seeing Zachary Holt again hit Thea like a physical blow. When had this happened? When had this quiet mountain man become important to her? It had been less than 2 days, barely enough time to know someone, yet she felt like she'd known him much longer. What if I didn't leave? She heard herself say. Zach went very still. What? Thea took a breath, hardly believing what she was about to suggest. What if I stayed? What if I brought the children back to Wyatt, settled things there, and came back here? Thea, Zach said carefully, you don't know what you're saying. This life, it's not easy. It's isolation, and hard work and months where you don't see another soul. You have a business in Wyatt. A life. Friends probably. You can't just give that up on a whim. It's not a whim, Thea said, and she realized it was true. I've been driving freight for 4 years, ever since my father died and left me the wagon and team. It's honest work and I'm good at it, but it's lonely too. I'm always on the road, always between places, never really belonging anywhere. I thought I liked it that way. Thought I was independent and strong and didn't need anybody. She smiled ruefully. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Zach's expression had gone very soft. Thea, he said again, and just the way he said her name made her shiver. I'm not saying I know for certain, she continued. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow or anything crazy like that. I'm just saying, maybe we could see, maybe I could come back after I settle things in Wyatt and we could spend some time together, really get to know each other. See if this feeling is real or just something that happened because of the storm and the crisis and everything we've been through. And if it is real? Zach asked quietly. Thea met his eyes. Then we figure it out. Together. Zach stood abruptly and crossed to her, and for a wild moment Thea thought he was going to pull her into his arms. But he stopped just short of touching her, his hands flexing at his sides as if he was fighting for control. I want that, he said, his voice rough. God help me, I want that more than I've wanted anything in years, but I won't let you make this decision rashly. You take the children back to Wyatt. You spend some time in civilization again. If you still want to come back after a few weeks, then we'll talk. And if I do come back, Thea asked, standing so they were face to face, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray-blue eyes. Then I'll be here, Zach said simply, waiting for you. The next 3 days passed in a strange golden haze. Sarah stronger, eating more and spending time out of bed. The boys explored the homestead under Zach's watchful eye, and he taught them how to identify animal tracks and which plants were good to eat and which were poison. He was patient with them, kind, and Thea found herself falling a little more in love with him every time she watched him interact with the children. Loathe, the word should have terrified her. She'd known him less than a week, but somehow it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. Zach rode down to check the fallen tree and came back 2 days later, exhausted but satisfied. He'd cleared enough of it that the wagon could get through, though it would be tight. The road was still muddy but passable if they were careful. On the 4th morning, they loaded the wagon for the journey back to Wyatt. Sarah was well enough to travel, wrapped in warm blankets. The boys were subdued, reluctant to leave this place that had become a refuge. Even Thea felt a deep reluctance to go, though she knew she had to. Zach helped her up onto the driver's bench, his big hands steady on her waist. Their eyes met and held. 2 weeks, Thea said. Give me 2 weeks to get the children settled and take care of my business in Wyatt. I'll come back. I'll be here, Zach promised. Then, before Thea could react, he leaned up and kissed her, quick and gentle. Be safe, Thea Kendrick. Be here when I get back, Zachary Holt, she replied, and snapped the reins. The journey back to Wyatt took 2 days of careful driving. The roads were still muddy from the storm, and Thea had to go slowly, but they made steady progress. The children were quiet, and Thea knew they were thinking about their parents and the cabin that had been their home. She talked to them about Wyatt, about Mrs. Patterson and the other children at the orphanage, trying to make it sound welcoming and safe. But in her heart, Thea was already planning. She'd sell the freight business to Tom Hardy, who'd been after her to partner with him for years. He'd pay a fair price, and she could use the money to buy supplies for the mountain homestead, things that would be useful through the long winter. She'd keep one horse for riding and sell the others. She'd pack up her father's old trunk with the few belongings that mattered to her. She'd say goodbye to the handful of people in Wyatt who had been kind to her. And then she'd ride back up into those mountains to the man who'd opened his gate and let her through. They reached Wyatt late on the 2nd day. The town was busy with evening traffic, people finishing their errands before supper. Thea drove straight to Mrs. Patterson's house, a large rambling place on the edge of town that always seemed to be bursting with children. Mrs. Patterson came out when she heard the wagon, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. When Thea explained about the Henderson children and what had happened to their parents, Mrs. Patterson's face creased with sorrow. Poor lambs, she said, gathering Sarah into her arms. Come inside, all of you. We'll get you fed and settled. Don't you worry. You're safe now. James and Thomas looked back at Thea with frightened eyes as Mrs. Patterson shepherded them toward the house. Thea climbed down from the wagon and knelt so she was at their level. I'm not leaving you, she promised. I'll be in town for another week or so, and I'll come visit every day. And even after I go, I'll write to you and send you things. You're not alone, you understand? James nodded slowly, then surprised her by throwing his arms around her neck. "Thank you for saving us," he whispered. Thea hugged him back, her eyes stinging. "You're very welcome, sweetheart." Over the next week, Thea worked furiously to settle her affairs. Tom Hardy was delighted to buy her freight business, and he paid her a good price that left her with a solid nest egg. She sold 3 of her horses but kept Daisy, a steady bay mare who was good on mountain trails. She bought supplies, practical things like flour and coffee and salt, but also luxuries like real sugar and tea, and a bolt of cloth she thought might make nice curtains for Zach's cabin. She visited the children every day as promised. They were adjusting slowly, making friends with the other orphans, but she could see they were still hurting. On her last visit before leaving, she sat with all 3 of them in Mrs. Patterson's parlor. "I'm going away for a while," she told them gently. "But I want you to know that what happened with you, finding you and bringing you here, it mattered to me. You matter to me, and if you ever need anything at all, you send word and I'll come. That's a promise." "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, clinging to Thea's hand. Thea smiled. "To the mountains, to live with a friend." "A very good friend, the big man?" James asked. "Mr. Zach?" "Yes," Thea said. "Mr. Zach." Thomas grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "He's nice. He told me I was brave." "You are brave," Thea said. "All 3 of you are. And you're going to grow up strong and good, and your parents would be so proud of you." She left them with hugs and promises to write, and tried not to cry as she walked away. Mrs. Patterson followed her out to the porch. "You're a good woman, Thea Kendrick," the older woman said. "Those children are lucky you found them. We'll take good care of them here, I promise you that." "I know you will," Thea said. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." It was the 13th day since she'd left Zach's cabin, when Thea finally rode out of Wyatt at dawn, Daisy's saddlebags packed with supplies and her own small trunk strapped behind the saddle. The sky was clear and blue, and the air had the crisp feel of early October. Soon winter would be coming to the mountains, and Thea knew that once the snow set in, travel would be impossible until spring. The thought didn't frighten her. If anything, the idea of being snowed in with Zachary Holt for months sounded perfect. The ride took a day and a half, but Thea knew the way now, and she pushed Daisy hard. She arrived at Zach's gate in the late afternoon of the second day, and her heart was pounding as she dismounted to open it. The gate swung wide easily, the chain and lock repaired. Thea led Daisy through and up the familiar trail. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, and as she rounded the last bend, she saw Zach step out onto the porch. He saw her and went absolutely still. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the clearing. Then Zach was striding toward her, covering the distance in long, quick steps, and Thea broke into a run. They met in the middle of the yard. Zach caught her up in his arms, lifting her clean off her feet, and Thea wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the longing and hope and love she'd been holding inside for 2 weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zach set her down but didn't let her go. His hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "You came back," he said, and his voice was raw with emotion. "I told you I would," Thea replied, smiling through happy tears. "I keep my promises." "Zachary Holt, Thea Kendrick," Zach said. "I've been alone for 5 years. Convinced myself I didn't need anyone. Then you drove your wagon through my gate in the middle of a storm and turned my whole world upside down. I love you. I know it's fast and probably crazy, but I love you and I want you to stay here with me. Not just for a visit, forever." Thea's heart felt like it might burst. "I love you too," she said, the words bubbling up like champagne. "And yes, I'll stay. Forever." Zach kissed her again, deeper this time, and Thea melted into him. He was solid and warm and strong, and he was hers. When they finally came up for air, Zach was grinning, a real smile that transformed his whole face. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's get your horse settled and your things inside. We have a lot to talk about." Over the next few hours, as they worked together to care for Daisy and unpack Thea's supplies, they talked about everything. Thea told him about the children and how they were settling in at Mrs. Patterson's. Zach told her about the improvements he wanted to make to the homestead before winter, how he wanted to build an addition to the cabin now that there would be 2 of them. Or maybe more than 2, he said, glancing at her with something like shyness. "Someday if you want." "I want," Thea said softly. "A family, children, a real home. I want all of it, Zach." That night they sat together by the fire, Thea tucked against Zach's side on the bench he'd built. It felt perfectly natural, perfectly right, as if she'd been sitting here her whole life. "We should probably get married," Zach said suddenly. "Properly, I mean. With a preacher. Soon as we can get down to town, Thea laughed. Are you proposing to me, Zachary Holt? I suppose I am, he said, sounding surprised at himself. Then his expression turned serious. Will you marry me, Thea? I don't have much to offer except this cabin in these mountains and myself, but what I have is yours if you want it. Yes, Thea said, turning to face him fully. Yes, I'll marry you, and what you're offering is everything I've ever wanted. Zach pulled her into his lap and kissed her until they were both breathless and laughing. Soon, he said against her mouth. We'll ride down to Wyatt soon as weather holds and get married proper. But Thea, in my heart, you're already my wife. And you're already my husband, Thea whispered back. They spent the next weeks preparing for winter in a flurry of activity. Zach showed Thea how to cure meat and store vegetables in the root cellar, how to stack wood properly so it would stay dry, how to read the sky for signs of coming weather. They worked side by side from dawn to dark, and at night they lay together in the loft bed, talking and planning and learning each other. Thea had never been happier. In mid-October, before the first big snow, they rode down to Wyatt and were married by the circuit preacher in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, with the Henderson children as witnesses. Sarah gave Thea a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself, and James and Thomas stood proud as honor guards. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears and provided a wedding cake. Zach wore his best clothes, which were still rough by town standards, but to Thea he looked perfect. He'd trimmed his beard and tied his hair back, and when he said his vows in that deep rumbling voice, promising to love and protect her all the days of his life, Thea thought her heart might explode with joy. They spent one night at the boarding house in Wyatt, their wedding night, and Thea learned what it was to be truly loved by a man who worshipped her with his whole being. Zach was gentle and patient and passionate, and Thea gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. The next morning they rode back to the mountain homestead as husband and wife. They arrived just as the first snow was beginning to fall, fat white flakes drifting down from a gray sky. Zach carried Thea over the threshold, both of them laughing, and the cabin welcomed them home. Winter settled in hard and deep. By November they were snowed in, the passes closed until spring. But Thea didn't mind. The cabin was warm and well supplied, and she had everything she needed right here. She and Zach fell into an easy rhythm, dividing chores and tasks, cooking together, reading aloud to each other from Zach's small collection of books, making love in front of the fire while the wind howled outside. In January, Thea realized she was pregnant. She told Zach on a bright, cold morning when the sun was brilliant on the snow and icicles hung from the cabin eaves like crystal daggers. Zach went very still when she said the words. Then a huge grin split his bearded face and he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. Baby, he kept saying, wonder in his voice. We're going to have a baby. The rest of the winter passed in a golden haze of anticipation. Zach was absurdly protective, barely letting Thea lift anything heavier than a teacup. He started work on a cradle, carving it from pine with painstaking care. At night he would put his hand on Thea's belly and talk to their unborn child, telling stories about the mountains and the animals and all the things they would do together when the baby was old enough. Spring came late that year, the snow finally melting in mid-April. As soon as the passes were clear, Zach rode to Wyatt for supplies and to bring news to Mrs. Patterson and the children. He came back 3 days later with his saddlebags full of practical things like baby clothes and diapers that the women of Wyatt had donated, and also a letter from Sarah, carefully printed, saying she was so happy about the baby and couldn't wait to meet him or her. They want to visit when the baby comes, Zach reported, if that's all right with you. More than all right, Thea said, touched. I'd love for them to meet our child. They're part of our story. The baby came in early September, nearly a year after the night Thea had driven her wagon through Zach's gate in the storm. Labor was hard and frightening, with only Zach to help, but he stayed calm and steady through it all, holding Thea's hand and wiping her face and telling her how strong she was, how much he loved her. When it was over and Thea held their son in her arms for the first time, she understood what Zach had meant about carrying love forever. This tiny person's, red-faced and squalling, was already the center of her universe. He's perfect, Zach said. His voice choked with emotion. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one big finger, and the infant grasped it reflexively. What should we name him? They'd talked about names all winter, but Thea knew instantly what felt right. Daniel, she said. After my father. Daniel Holt, Zach said, testing it. He smiled. It's good. It's strong. He leaned down and kissed Thea's forehead. You're amazing, both of you. True to their word, Mrs. Patterson brought the Henderson children up to visit when Daniel was a month old. The children were thriving, growing taller and healthier, though Thea could see they still carried the scars of what they'd lost. They were fascinated by the baby, taking turns holding him with great care under Thea's supervision. "He's so small," Sarah breathed, cradling Daniel like he was made of glass. "Was I ever this small?" "Smaller," Thea told her. "Everyone starts small, but you grow into yourself." Before they left, James pulled Thea aside. He was 11 now, shooting up tall, and his voice was starting to change. "Thank you," he said seriously, "for everything you did for us. For saving us and bringing us here and making sure we were taken care of. I won't ever forget it." Thea hugged him. "You don't have to thank me, James, but you're welcome. And remember, you always have a place here, all three of you. This is your home, too, if you ever need it." The years that followed were the happiest of Thea's life. She and Zach built a life together in the mountains, carving out a homestead that was part of the wilderness but also distinctly their own. Daniel grew strong and healthy, learning to walk and talk, and eventually to help with chores around the place. He had Zach's gray-blue eyes and Thea's dark hair, and his laughter rang through the mountains like bells. When Daniel was 3, Thea gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Marcus and Rose. Zach expanded the cabin again to make room, building 2 more rooms and a real kitchen. The place was filled with noise and life and love. Everything Zach had thought he didn't want, but had secretly craved all along. The Henderson children visited every summer when the passes were clear. They grew up strong and good, as Thea had known they would. Sarah became a teacher, James a carpenter, Thomas a blacksmith. They never forgot the woman who had saved them, and the mountain man who had given them shelter, and they brought their own families to visit in the years that followed. On summer evenings, Thea would sit on the porch with Zach, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over the mountains. Zach would take her hand and they'd sit in comfortable silence, no words needed after so many years together. "Do you ever regret it?" Zach asked once, on a particularly golden evening when Rose and Marcus were chasing fireflies and Daniel was reading a book by the last of the light. "Giving up your old life? Choosing this?" Thea squeezed his hand. "Not for a single second," she said honestly. "I was just existing before, Zach, going through the motions. You taught me what it means to really live." "You taught me the same thing," Zach said quietly. "I was dead inside, just going through the motions same as you. Then you drove your wagon through my gate and woke me back up." "We saved each other," Thea said. "Yeah," Zach agreed, pulling her close. "We did." Years passed, seasons cycling from spring bloom to summer heat to autumn color to winter white and back again. The children grew up and eventually left the mountain to make lives of their own, though they always came back to visit. Daniel became a doctor, taking his skills to the small towns scattered through the Missouri mountains. Marcus took over the homestead, expanding it into a proper ranch. Rose married a lawyer from St. Louis, but insisted on spending every summer in the mountains where she'd grown up. Thea and Zach grew older together, their hair going gray, their bodies slowing down but their love never diminishing. They were grandparents many times over, and the cabin that had once been a hermit's retreat became a gathering place for a sprawling extended family. On a warm September evening, almost 40 years after that stormy night when Thea had shot the lock off Zach's gate, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Zach's hair was white now, his beard long and shot through with silver, but his eyes were still that same striking gray-blue. Thea's own hair had gone silver too, and her hands were lined with age, but she still moved with the strength and grace that had first caught Zach's attention. "Remember the storm?" Thea asked, as she often did. It had become their origin story, the tale they told their children and grandchildren. "Every detail," Zach said, smiling. "Remember thinking you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, standing there covered in mud with a gun in your hand and fire in your eyes." "I was terrified," Thea admitted. "Thought you might shoot me for breaking your lock." "Couldn't shoot the woman I was going to marry," Zach said, teasing. "You didn't know that then, didn't I?" Zach turned to look at her, his expression soft with love. "Maybe I did. Maybe I knew it the moment I saw you." Thea leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sun sink below the mountains together, surrounded by the life they'd built, the family they'd created them, through decades of joy and sorrow and everything in between. "I'd do it all again," Thea said softly. "Every moment. Every choice, everything that brought me here to you." "So would I," Zach said, kissing the top of her head. "So would I." And as the stars came out over the Missouri mountains, Thea thought about that desperate girl driving a wagon through lightning and mud, terrified and determined and alone. She thought about the man who had opened his gate and let her through, who had offered shelter and safety and eventually love beyond measure. She thought about the children they'd saved and the children they'd made, about the life that had grown from one stormy night and one desperate choice. The mountains were eternal, standing long before humans walked them, and destined to stand long after. But for this brief moment in time, Thea and Zach had carved out their own piece of forever, and it was more than either of them had ever dreamed possible. As winter crept in again and the first snow began to fall, Thea and Zach moved inside to the warmth of the fire, still together, still in love, still grateful every single day for the storm that had brought them together. Their story would be told by their children and grandchildren for generations. The tale of the freight woman who drove through lightning and the mountain man who opened his gate, and how love had bloomed in the wilderness and lasted a lifetime. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A life well lived, love freely given and received, and the knowledge that they had mattered to each other and to the world. Thea fell asleep that night in Zach's arms, as she had for 40 years, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mountains stood silent witness to their story, as they had to countless stories before and would to countless stories after. But this one, the story of Thea and Zach, was written in every log of the cabin they'd built together, in every fence post Marcus had helped his father set, in every recipe Rose had learned from her mother, in every patient Daniel treated with the compassion his parents had taught him. It was written in the Henderson children, who had grown up knowing that kindness and courage could save lives. It was written in the gate that stood open now, welcoming all who needed shelter. It was written in the land itself, tended and loved and passed down through generations. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the pines and the moon shone silver on the snow, if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of wagon wheels rolling through mud, the crack of thunder, and a woman's voice calling out for help. And you might hear, too, the sound of a gate opening, a man's voice saying, "Come inside. You're safe now," and two hearts beginning to beat as one. Some love stories start with a glance across a crowded room. Some start with a chance meeting in a city street. But this love story started with a desperate ride through a storm, a locked gate, and one man's decision to let a stranger through. And from that moment of connection, a lifetime of love had grown. Thea and Zach lived many more years in their mountain home, surrounded by family and love, their story becoming legend in the scattered communities of the Missouri mountains. And when they finally passed, first Zach and then Thea, less than a year later, they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, with a view of the mountains they'd both loved so much. The inscription on their shared stone was simple but spoke volumes. She drove through the storm. He opened the gate. Together they found home. And the gate stood open still, a symbol of the hospitality and love that had defined their lives, welcoming all who needed shelter from the storms of life. Just as Zachary Holt had once welcomed Thea Kendrick on a lightning-struck night so long ago, their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the homestead that continued to thrive, in the stories told and retold around countless fires. And sometimes, on stormy nights, the people living in the valley claimed they could still see a wagon driving through the rain, 4 horses pulling hard, and a figure standing on a porch with a lantern held high, lighting the way home. The end came peacefully for both of them, as they'd lived, together and surrounded by love. And if there is a heaven, you can be sure they're there together still, watching over their mountain, their family, their home, forever grateful for the storm that brought them together and the love that never let them go.